Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Female Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Danny, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Bekka, who is a disordered eating nutritionist and coach. She's also a counsellor and psychotherapy student as well. And today we're going to talk about binge eating and where to start when it comes to tackling binge eating. But first of all, Bekka, how did you originally sort of get into the fitness industry?
So hi everyone, and thanks so much for having me, Danny. And thanks for that little introduction. So how did I get into the fitness industry? So I suppose I have a similar enough story in that when I was growing up, I would have been overweight as a child, as a teenager, and I got into fitness and I loved it. It was one of those like it's changed my life moments. Like weight training has changed so many people's lives, but it really, really had a positive impact. I was finally able to like eat to fuel performance and not be so terrified of food all the time. But like so many others, I went a little bit too extreme with dieting. I started doing like fitness photo shoots. And I suppose it highlighted a lot of issues within my relationship with food that I hadn't resolved from when I was younger. So I ended up like losing my period and having just a really horrible relationship with food. I wanted to compete. Again, like so many others, transition from photo shoots into competing. But at that point, I was like, okay, I have no period. I'm obsessed with food. I can't stop thinking about it. This is not the right path for me. So I let that go after a lot of resistance. And that's when my own healing journey started. And I started my own business after studying my nutrition course and that. So yeah, got here from my own experience, but also just I love coaching as well. So I'm on the ETPHD team, which is directed by Amelia Thompson, obviously, and I specialize in helping women get their periods back. And I more recently went down the counselling psychotherapy route. So now myself and the dietitian on the team, we work with people with eating disorders, which is really exciting. So binge eating is obviously what we'll be discussing today. So I'm excited to go there.
Out of interest, Becky, when it came to you sort of making the decision not to go down the competing route, did you make that yourself, or did you have to have someone tell you like this is not for you?
Ultimately, I had to make it myself. Like, I think when you're in that position, you can be given all the advice in the world, but you need to want to make that decision yourself, if that makes sense. Yes, I certainly had people saying, you need to take a break, you need to, go into a gaining phase or just stop dieting for a while. And I resisted that for so long. It was me who had to be like, okay, this doesn't align with my values anymore. I can't do this to myself. So a bit of both. Yeah, it just takes time to actually take on advice, doesn't it?
100%. And when it came to you actually working to improve your own relationship with food, how did you get started on that? Did you do that mostly like on your own, or did you work with a coach?
I did a lot of it on my own. I think the biggest part for me was actually truly like feeling like I was aligned to my values. So for a long time, my values were just how I looked, how lean I was, how many likes I got on social media, or how much engagement I got, that type of stuff. And it overshadows all the other stuff. When I realized I was isolated from my friends, I couldn't enjoy social meals with my family. I wasn't sitting down at a table with people and connecting. Like I didn't want to go on holidays and stuff because it interrupted my routine. Then that's when I really thought, okay, this isn't working for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, got to the point on my own, but then had some support as well along the way, which I think is really important.
Definitely.
Because it doesn't just get solved overnight, it comes back.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult sort of journey to navigate completely on your own, and you usually need some kind of support. Otherwise, it is likely to take a lot longer to actually recover, and you might not even get there in the first place. Mm-hmm. So to give people a bit of like a better idea, what actually is binge eating and how does it differ from overeating?
Yeah, so this is a really good question because they often get mixed up, basically. So binge eating and overeating are different. They're not the same. So binge eating is associated with like a loss of control, and it's usually done rapidly. Overeating then is, yes, it's still eating beyond fullness, but there's usually more awareness around that. So it might be that you're sitting down with a delicious meal, you recognize it's delicious and you want to keep eating it. Whereas binge eating is, you don't actively decide, okay, I'm going to just smash this packet of biscuits. It can very often be done on autopilot, and there's a lot of guilt and shame around it. Oftentimes it's done in secret. Or, you know, a very common one is when you're left at home alone, or people leave the house, for example. So more shame associated definitely with overeating, although they can overlap a lot of the time. But there is like certain diagnostic criteria, which if anyone is wondering, you'll find on the DSM-5, if you just type that into Google, you'll see the binge eating criteria, and the frequency of which it happens kind of determines if it's a binge eating disorder, or if you're kind of on the way there, or if it's just emotional eating. So there's differences, but a lot of the time they do overlap, so it can be a little confusing.
Yeah. And why is it actually important to distinguish the difference between binge eating and overeating?
The thing that's coming to mind for me the most is it's not a willpower issue. So if somebody thinks that their binge eating is a willpower issue, they're going to look in all the wrong places for the right answer or support for it. So they might look for, you know, a coach that's going to give them exact calories to stick to, or a meal plan to follow rigidly. So it's really important, because it's not a choice, and it's not a willpower issue, and it's not something that you decide to do. So you can't overcome it then by being more disciplined or strict on yourself or trying harder. And that really is like adding fuel to a blazing fire. It can make things so much worse, because already there's a lot of guilt and shame, right? So I know I had a call with someone just yesterday who said to me, you know, up until this point, I thought I was just greedy. I thought I just couldn't not eat everything. And she'd been carrying that for her whole life. And so can you imagine then going and being told like, oh, you just don't want this enough, or you need to try harder, like cop on kind of thing. So yeah, it is. And it's important for not only the person suffering, but also people who come into contact like ourselves, to be aware of this.
I also think on the flip side of that as well, if someone is just overeating and they perceive that to be, if they tell themselves, oh, I'm binging, but in reality, they're just, you know, sat in front of the TV with their family and they've had too many chocolates and they've made a conscious decision to do that. If they believe that, if they tell themselves that they're binging and they identify with that, they can almost feel a little bit stuck, because of they've like pathologized it, whereas in reality it's probably less of an issue than they actually think it is, and that can be a problem as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, totally, because that can keep someone stuck as well, like putting the label on as, oh, I binge eat, I have no control, I'm just this person, when in actual fact it might not be that. Or it might be, yes, you're having binge eating tendencies, but you're not actually at a point where you can't overcome it. There's a lot of like labels attached and core beliefs when you struggle with food. It's like, oh, I'm just this person, I'll always be this person type thing. So the stories we tell ourselves is so important. Like you just mentioned, it can be almost the opposite effect.
Yeah, it's sometimes like taking the power back and realizing, you know, if someone is, for example, overeating, it is very much most of the time a conscious decision, and if they realize that, then it can be easier to tackle, as opposed to them thinking, oh, like I'm stuck. It's just something that, you know, that I do every single day.
Yeah. And like it can become habitual as well. So it can almost become like, you know, when you drive somewhere and you can't remember the journey, it can almost become like your habit. So let's say this is a really common one where people will binge when they get home from work. And like, yes, it may have started because your stress levels were through the roof and you had no way of regulating yourself, but it can become then the habit of what you do. So when I get home, I go to the cupboard and I binge, you know, so that aspect of it is important to remember too, that it's not always like what it started with. It can manifest then into just your habits, which obviously is still a difficult one to overcome.
Yeah. And what is the difference between someone having a binge, say on like a one-off occasion, to someone actually having a clinical binge eating disorder?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, the symptoms above of like the secret eating, the loss of control, the guilt and shame. You have to, I suppose, take a couple of boxes like any other mental health diagnosis. You have to have the certain criteria. The frequency, I would say, is the big thing then. So you have to have at least 2 days a week for 6 months, or at least 1 day a week for 3 months to quote unquote qualify for a binge eating disorder. I think, it's important to recognize the criteria for the actual disorder, but it's also not to underestimate. If you don't tick all those boxes, it doesn't mean that you're not struggling, in the same way. So not to undermine it if you don't.
It's like you can still benefit from help. If you think you're struggling, don't be afraid to seek help. Don't just put it off because you're not ticking the diagnostic criteria, for example.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. We know disordered eating is a spectrum anyway. So one side of the spectrum is your healthy relationship with food. In the middle is like a disordered relationship. And then you have full-blown eating disorders. And often a disordered eating, can lead to an eating disorder. So don't wait until you're quote unquote bad enough, which we see so often, don't we? It's like, I wasn't struggling enough to seek support.
Yeah. And usually if people do wait until that point as well, it's so much harder to then get back to having a good relationship with food. Whereas if they nip it in the bud when they notice that there's some disordered eating traits kicking in, it's so much easier to address.
Yeah, for sure.
I saw your post on Instagram as well about the 4 stages of a binge and thought that was a really, really good post. What are they for anyone listening that's not seen that post, and why is it helpful to identify them?
Okay, well, thank you for that. The carousel posts are still alive and well, it seems. So the 4 stages of binge. So we have like the tension build up, which is when you have that emotional brewing, we'll say. This stage is like, I would say, the most important if you had to pick, because you get to a point where you're almost too far gone and that you're too dysregulated to think clearly, to think rationally, to use your coping skills. So during this tension build-up phase, it's really important to become aware of how your body's feeling, how you're feeling. So being able to name your emotions, being able to see how your breathing is, how your heart rate is, how your body feels. So at that point, we really try to bring awareness to your overall state emotionally and physically. So journaling at that point for anyone is helpful. Then we have the tension release when the build up peaks, and it's really when you're so dysregulated that it feels so unbearable, and that's when people will distract or try to numb out and avoid the difficult feeling or the difficult emotion. We're always told from such a young age, don't feel difficult emotions, dry your eyes, cop on, be a big girl. And so that we bring that into our adult life as well. Then it's no, there's no room for that difficult feeling, dry your eyes, numb it out. So that's where the tension release comes from. And it does, I suppose, work in the moment temporarily. You do get the brain lighting up, the dopamine hit. And when you're in that moment and you're eating, that's all you can think about. So it makes logical sense, but it doesn't solve anything long term.
Yeah.
And actually it just ends up feeling, the person ends up feeling worse. And that's where we come to the post binge, which is where you have the binge hangover, mentally and physically. You might be in pain, or you might be just emotionally worn out and I can't believe this has happened again. Why does this keep happening? And that really impacts self-worth then as well, and self-belief. So you can see at this point, it's a very vicious cycle. And then there comes the new beginning, which is, okay, this isn't going to happen anymore. I'm going to go back dieting again. I'm going to restrict harder again, and cop on, basically. So the harsh inner critic comes in, the self-compassion is nowhere to be seen, and it's just, this is your fault. You chose to do this and you're a bad person. None of that is true, but that's what the type of stuff we see people saying to themselves. So the restricting and the dieting comes again. So we can see then it goes back up to the urge to binge. So that's why intervening at some point, ideally at the build-up phase, is crucial.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful for people to identify why they're doing something and identify this process as you've just spoken through, because it helps them understand why they're doing what they're doing and what's happening at each stage, rather than them thinking, oh my God, like, why am I binging? What's wrong with me? Like, what's happening? And like you said, it helps them understand when it might be most effective to intervene as well.
Yeah, for sure. And like a lot of this is awareness, because
Yeah.
all spend so much time on autopilot as it is. Now, I don't mind if you're someone who, like, let's say a big one for us, especially in the therapy space, is people who have experienced some trauma in the past. Now, it doesn't have to be this big, we could say big T trauma and small T trauma. Like a big T trauma would be when you endured some emotional or physical or sexual abuse, let's say. And then the small T might be something that others might deem as small. It might be being left out in the playground or something. But they all have an impact. And a coping response to trauma that's unresolved is this dissociation. And binge eating goes hand in hand with that, because often when people are binging, they're also dissociating. So they almost feel like they're having an outer body experience. So yeah, it's like the awareness there of, okay, this is actually happening, or this is something that's happening to me, to work through that fully is key. And as well, the other one that we see nearly all the time, 99% of the time, is this inability to regulate emotions. So emotional dysregulation, which again involves a lot of awareness, how you're feeling physically and emotionally. So yeah, you're so right in that. It's to be able to point.
I think it's so powerful as well to recognize for people that are struggling that disordered eating often happens when we are dysregulated, because again, it helps them identify, okay, like if I can become more regulated and address whatever the underlying cause is, then that can be powerful in terms of making a change. What could you give an example of what someone being dysregulated might look like?
Yeah. So I suppose it might look differently to how it feels. Someone could actually appear like they're calm, and then in the inside there's like chaos happening. It can present differently in everyone. So it might feel like agitation for you. It might feel like a feeling of losing control for you. It might feel like you're angry, stressed. So it will present differently for everyone. I suppose the bottom line is it's uncomfortable to feel dysregulated. A natural response is you want to get rid of it. And that's where you might use food or scrolling on social media or body checking, something along those lines, to just give you that temporarily relief or distraction. So like if you're listening to this and you're not sure what your dysregulation looks like, get curious about it. Think the next time you feel some discomfort, or you have a pull to an impulse to like grab your phone or grab food, just take a second to breathe and notice, okay, how am I feeling? How does my body feel? So even if you put the wheel of emotions into Google, you'll get the wheel of emotions that comes up, and you'll be able to see all the different emotions and where they stem from. And it can be really helpful to pinpoint what you're actually feeling. So like you might think, oh, I'm just stressed or I'm just bored. But actually there could be something from your day where you felt something like rejection, or you felt betrayed, or you felt lonely. And obviously the solutions to those feelings are a lot different to just being bored or stressed. So we'll do this a lot with clients, where we'll get them to do like I statements and solutions to their common, I suppose, trigger emotions. So it might be literally something as simple as, when I'm lonely, I will call my best friend. I will, make a plan to have coffee tomorrow with somebody. And something as simple as that, just having it concretely there, can be really soothing. So I can't remember the initial question. So I hope
I think that was great. I basically asked like what can dysregulation feel or look like in different people, and I think you explained that really well.
We bring in a lot more somatic stuff now as well to our coaching. So we're focused very much so on like how your body is feeling, because our bodies actually recognize a trigger a lot of the time before our mind even does. So it's kind of like that concept of, if you're walking across the street and a car comes, like you kind of dive you know, you try to step back or you run forward before you actually realize, okay, I'm going to be hit by a car. So our bodies react before our minds a lot of the time. So we've started bringing in like body scans, breath work, a lot of that into our coaching more so now, which is, you know, it's a game changer really.
Yeah. You mentioned there taking a pause and getting curious. Are there any other tools or practices that you would commonly implement with clients who you find are a little bit dysregulated and that might be a cause of disordered eating?
Yeah, so I suppose we have short-term in the moment solutions as well as the longer term ones. So like obviously the likes of meditation and breath work and, you know, mindfulness and self-compassion in general are crucial. But then we use like techniques for in the moment urges, like surf the urge, you'll probably be aware of that. And different like, again, breathwork stuff that we can bring in or move or intentional movement. So there's a lot there, and it's dependent on every different person what will resonate. But an overall, I would say mindfulness is such a huge one because it's all done on autopilot. So it makes sense then that being more present and more intentional with every different area of life and slowing down. Gosh, slowing down is like, it's so simple, but it's so effective because when we're rushing, we have that fight or flight response, and cortisol is high, stress levels are through the roof. And that's when usually people get to the point where they just want to reach because nobody likes feeling that stressed state. So slowing down, reminding yourself and your body that you're safe and that everything is actually going to be okay. And even I say to clients, like literally say slow down out loud, even say it slowly, slow down. And they're like laughing at me. And then they're like, oh, I tried that thing and it worked. So yeah, that's a big one, mindfulness.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant because I think in today's day and age, everyone is always rushing around and everyone is also constantly stimulated and lives their lives like very non-intentionally. So if we can encourage more intentional living and more intentional practices, it's only going to have a positive effect. And like a simple example is when people are like bored or they want to seek a bit of a dopamine hit or stimulation, they'll often go to social media. And something that I've actually done over the past few weeks is I've deleted Instagram off of my home screen. So when I go on it, I have to actually type it in, and it makes you be a little bit more intentional about, okay, what am I doing this for?
Yeah, for sure. Or like the timer where you set a timer on it and you do have to press ignore if you want to keep going. It just creates like that space to actually think about it, to bring you back. Okay, is this actually what I want to do? But yeah, social media, you brought it up, and it's a big one when it comes to this, because of like the impact external things can have on either recovery or, you know, the advice that you don't need to hear type thing. So filtering your feed is such a huge one, and like making sure that what you're exposing yourself to is actually helpful, because it's when you're in that vulnerable place, you will seek out nearly the opposite of what you need, isn't it? It's like if someone's struggling with binge eating and they want to achieve body composition goals, they're going to go and like seek out quote unquote motivation or images of bodies to help with that, or what they perceive will help with that. So I would say social media, it's not to like, you can't go on it or delete it, but just be really mindful of what you consume and what advice you take on board.
Yeah. And I almost think if someone is really struggling with the sort of their use of social media and them not being very intentional with it, it can sometimes have its place to remove it completely, to then come back to it, just to make them realize to be more intentional about living in the moment and all of that good stuff, but also to just question like, okay, when I come back to this, how am I going to, if I've seen a positive effect from coming away from it, when I come back to it, how am I going to use that more intentionally so that it doesn't have a negative effect on me?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, present dependent again, but I don't think there's ever any harm taking a bit of a break for people.
What, in terms of social media and obviously the fitness space on social media, do you think it's helpful for people who are struggling with their relationship with food to be exposing themselves to most fitness content on social media? And if not, why can it be unhelpful?
Okay, so like it's I always find this hard because my echo chamber, like you're on my social media and stuff, and it like I can see how if I was struggling, like that would be helpful because you're literally getting such value and tips and stuff. But again, like I was just saying, when you're in that vulnerable place and you're not really that far along, maybe even in knowing you have stuff to work through, you can seek out the Fitspos and a lot of like bodies and, you know, that type of thing, which isn't going to help you if you're really struggling with your body image in terms of like self-comparison, expectations. Also, you'll see like what I eat in a day and things. And if you're binging and if you're trying to follow someone who's eating in a deficit, like that's not going to help.
Yeah.
So it's hard to give one answer, but it's really dependent on you. And even if one day you notice when you're scrolling that you're feeling triggered or you start comparing or thinking about what you ate or whatever, like just mute and say, okay, I like that person maybe, but I'll come back to it at a different time. If it evokes any sort of difficult emotion in you, then it's not serving you at that time. So yeah, that's what I would say on that one. And just to, I suppose if something is coming across as extreme, to ban something or to avoid something completely, then that's also not going to align with binge eating recovery, unless you have an intolerance or something.
Yeah, definitely. No, I like that advice. I think it's just about knowing yourself, being self-aware and being intentional about using it in a positive way if you're going to use it. And also having the, you know, self-discipline to mute or unfollow any accounts that aren't helpful rather than just constantly exposing yourself to those things.
Yeah, I think you're so right. It's like a discipline thing because you do get some sort of a kick out of it in terms of like, this is going to motivate me. This is what I want. And it often does the opposite of that. It's like it gives you that feeling of being restricted because let's face it, if you're trying to strive for someone else's body and you think that restricting is going to help you do that or get there, then it's going to spark all this again. So yeah, intentional use for sure.
100%. And people listening to this have probably seen, most people have probably seen anyway, some coaches sort of advertising their services in regards to helping to improve food relationships, but then attaching it to an external end product in terms of body composition related progress. Why can that sometimes be problematic?
The obvious reason, I guess, is often the person doesn't have the qualifications or they might have personal experience, but they may not have like the skills to help someone. You know, like as coaches, we can't work with people with eating disorders. It's just dietitians and therapists. So that number one, we see a lot of that happening, just to be really mindful of, is this actually appropriate? And a lot of the time it's not even bad intentioned. It's just that people are like, I got through this. As you know, it's like, if I can do it, I can show you how I did it type thing. But there's so many different drivers and everyone's so different that just because your situation was one way doesn't mean the other person's is going to be the same. Using the body to sell then is a slippery slope because with binge eating recovery, like fat loss can't be the priority, definitely not at the beginning anyway, because it's all about, you know, reducing the binges, in incorporating regular eating to satiety and things, which might be going against dieting strategies. So the goal at the beginning isn't to strive for a certain aesthetic. Now, we're not idiots. We know that most people, if they're at a larger body, and they're struggling with binge eating, they'll want to lose some weight, and that's fine. And I think it's really important for me to just say here as well that binge eating disorder does not have a certain body type. I work with people who are both underweight, in a normal healthy BMI range, or in an overweight obese category as well, and you know they'll still have the same feelings, symptoms and stuff. So that's just one thing to note there. But yeah, it can't be the main and only focus, and promising someone that they're going to look a certain way after they recover is just like it's just like overlooking so many different factors. And And it's just going around in circles, basically.
Yeah. And it's, at the end of the day, it's probably going to take away from their ability to progress from a relationship with food perspective if they're just focused on other areas, which are counterproductive at the end of the day and require very different protocols.
Exactly. Yeah. And like at this point, they've probably spent most of their life trying to look a certain way and achieve a certain body composition goal. So why look for the same solution in the same place when it hasn't worked out in the past? But it's an easy one to get sucked into. Like I've definitely seen, you know, people with ab shots saying, I'm going to help you cure binge eating. And can't you see exactly why someone who was in a really difficult place and felt like had a really poor body image and stuff would buy into that? Of course they would. It's like, what do you call it? I don't know, clickbait or
Yeah.
Yeah, so something to be really mindful of. Check who you're working with and what they have to offer and what qualifications they have and their values, I suppose, as a coach.
Yeah. And it's obviously not to say that, you know, someone who is struggling with their relationship with food, that doesn't mean that they can never have body composition related goals ever again.
Exactly.
But it's like, okay, address what you need to address now. And if and when appropriate, you can come back to that.
Yeah. So just to give people an idea, like if someone is binging regularly, we will start off by setting like a regular eating routine and we'll create more structure. Oftentimes we'll actually even give them like a meal plan template. That's a little bit we'll get into in a second as well. So the goal initially is to reduce the binges, not even to get rid of them for some people, is to reduce it. And then as time goes on, when they have more, I suppose, they feel more in control of their eating habits, we will lessen that. So they'll have less of a structure or a rigid structure and start like increasing their food variety and challenging their fear foods or their trigger foods. And then along those lines, somewhere we'll get to intuitive eating. It might be way down the line, but it will come at some point. And they'll, you know, be able to tune into their hunger and fullness again, because that gets lost along the way, because like hunger hormones, ghrelin and things get dysregulated, and when you have binge eating disorders, they're often not accurate or in the right place. So it takes time to be able to be intuitive and it takes time to get to that place. But yeah, it's just it's a bit of a process and you can't jump straight ahead to body composition goals. And it's like you said, it's not to say that you can't ever have them. You may be able to track again in the future if you wanted to. In a gentle way, of course, but it's just like not a blanket rule of no, you can't ever want fat loss or you can't ever track. I think those extremities are nearly more harmful than anything.
You made a really good point there as well, like the importance of being patient throughout this process. It's not just a case of, you know, someone's not just going to come and work with you when they're struggling with binge eating and then in a week's time they're not going to be binging anymore. And I think that's really important to recognize, so that then those people don't then see themselves as a failure if they do have a date where they struggle with their relationship with food, for example.
Yeah, for sure. We always say that too. We're like, we don't expect you to never binge again. And actually, when you binge, when we're working together, it allows us to like unpack it and see, okay, what happened? What happened before it? How are you feeling? What can we do next time? It's unrealistic to expect yourself to never even have that knee-jerk reaction again, ever again. And it's just about not being afraid of it anymore and knowing that you actually do have the power, that food and binging doesn't control you anymore. But as you said, it's a process that takes patience, and getting to that place takes time.
Yeah. And if people need to put it into perspective, I think it can be helpful to recognize, okay, like, how long have I been struggling with my relationship with food? It's not going to be an overnight process to address all of that and unpack all of that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned also using sort of meal plan template with some clients.
Mm-hmm.
Is it appropriate to use a meal plan approach to tackle binge eating? And if it is, if you do sometimes use that approach, where is it appropriate and where might it not be appropriate?
Yeah, so again, person dependent, like that's why our coaching is person centered. Or sorry, I should speak here in like a more my therapeutic role. Sometimes I use like language that I use when coaching, but just to clear it up for people. So as a coach, I don't work with people who have a binge eating disorder. the ETPHD method have introduced like dietetic support and therapeutic support. So I work with people who have eating disorders in the therapy space now, alongside the dietitian on our team. So I know from her point of view, she'd use meal plans sometimes. Person dependent, like I mentioned, and that is why our coaching is person centered. Like I'm sure yours is as well. Some people will respond great to it, other people won't. They'll feel too restricted. But at the start, like eating habits can be completely erratic. There could be no structure there. So people do need a lot of the time to have something to refer to. Like, yes, I need to eat every 3 to 4 hours. And this is all with the intention of reducing binges. That's kind of the goal of that. And it doesn't really go any further. In time, we want them to come away from the meal plan, obviously, and to have freedom, choice, food variety. So short term, I would say it's appropriate for some people, for sure, and not for others. It just depends. I think what's after happening a little bit is meal plans were like laughed at, and like, like it's like, oh, don't go to them. They just give you a meal plan. That's ridiculous. And yeah, it is ridiculous for other situations, but it does serve its purpose, is what I'm trying to say, in some situations. So just keep in mind it's short term, and what we want to like make sure is that you do have unconditional permission to eat anyway, that if you want something you can have it, and that's a really key part of it, because it's that restriction and that scarcity that will really drive the urge. Like if you heard that your favorite food in the world was being like banned in an hour, you'd be like, oh my God, I need to go buy it. I need to stock my fridge up with it. And it's a natural response from us. So same applies for you. If you really, really think you can't have something because it's bad, you're going to want it 10 times more.
And for context, if your dietitian was to give someone, say, a meal plan or an example meal plan, would that be just foods that they've put together, or would they take into account the client's preferences, and would it involve variety? Because I know that there are some coaches who do give out meal plans and they will literally be the same foods every single day, and they won't have much sort of freedom or flexibility with that. Is that appropriate, or would yours have more variety in?
So when our clients come on board, they give us like food diaries and what they like, dislike, what they can have, what doesn't agree with them, for example. So no, we don't do generic meal plans. So it would be like, I like to call it a template because that's a little bit more flexible. It would be what the person actually genuinely likes eating anyway. So yeah, that's a key part. So thanks for bringing that up. It wouldn't just be like, you have to have salmon and rice now, and then at 2 you have to have a whey it's what they can actually tolerate and enjoy as well.
I think it's important to make that distinction, just because some people, like for example in the bodybuilding space, which is my background, there would have been certain clients who would probably go to a different prep coach, having struggled with their relationship with food, be put on a meal plan, convince themselves that that meal plan has fixed all of their issues, but in reality it's just masking a lot of issues, and they still have them there when they then come out of contest prep or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's so common, isn't it? It's like, oh, the meal plan and prep saved my relationship with food. And like it does temporarily, when you have such a rigid control in it, it's like you have no choice but to stay and remain in the same place. And the second those gates open, that's when we see like, no, it actually didn't save. Well, I can't speak for everyone here. Maybe some people it has, but that's when we see like the binging start. It's the second that the plaster is taken off, or the second there's any little scope to eat different foods. It can be really hard then to maintain.
And even if, from my perspective, like if someone does say they follow a meal plan, I don't know, they've been bodybuilding for several years and they genuinely feel like that's improved their relationship with food after they were struggling with something like binge eating beforehand. What worries me is, okay, yes, that might have happened for several years, but what about when bodybuilding is removed completely? Like, what about when they come away from the sport and they no longer have that extreme goal in the back of their mind?
Yeah, that is definitely one. Because it doesn't just go away. Like there's so many different reasons why binge eating can be an issue for people, and a lot of the time it is like chronic dieting over a period of time, and real restriction over a period of time, but that is literally just one facet of it, and there's usually a combination of different things. So it might be, like I mentioned earlier on, like something from the past, unresolved trauma from the past, or trying to numb emotions that you've been trying to avoid, or like unmet needs in your present life, like a lack of connection, isolation, that sort of thing. So when it comes to bodybuilding, then for some, like, you can tick all those boxes because it is a bit isolating for people. It can be. You do have that restrictive dieting, and a lot of the time people who are attracted to bodybuilding as well have like the perfectionist tendencies and the all or nothing way of thinking. Sometimes, not always, but would you agree that you'd see like perfectionist tendencies in the sport?
Yeah, 100% amongst most people in reality,
Yeah.
because you have to, that in bodybuilding, obviously you're striving to be as optimal as you possibly can. And so therefore it naturally attracts perfectionists who have already been trying to do that for their entire
It's
life,
just
basically, because they feel like, okay, that's something I'm good at. And so they'll gravitate towards bodybuilding.
Yeah, and it's the perfect scenario. Like, you get to be rigid, you get to tick all your boxes, you get to have major control over like what your body does, how it changes, what you eat. So it's like the perfect storm. And then when like you come away from it and you're no longer following a meal plan, or you're no longer like tracking meticulously, you can still have those attitudes towards your eating and your life. And it's really hard to cope with that. Like, it's really hard. It's like, how do I measure my worth? How do I measure my success? Like, I'm out of control. That's the big one we hear, is like, I have no control anymore. And then like the binges come a lot of the time when you do miss a beat or you do miss a step and you do eat something that you didn't deem as appropriate or whatever. And the gates open then for like, right, well, we might as well just keep going because we've screwed it anyway, and I'm useless and I'm worthless. Not that that's funny, but it's just, I'm trying to say how it can be for people.
Yeah. I think even aside from binge eating, bodybuilding sort of almost replicates a very similar pattern or scenario that someone who maybe had something like anorexia would participate in. And that can be quite worrying, because I think it could very easily be a way for someone to still be having those issues with food. Say someone had anorexia and they then got into bodybuilding and claimed that they were fine, they were fixed. It would be very easy for them to sort of engage in the disordered eating habits that they have always had, but give it a name and almost make it acceptable because it's a sport.
Yeah, for sure. It's just, I suppose it's just more acceptable in that environment, and it's normalized and it's glorified actually as well. And like, this isn't bashing bodybuilding at all. Like, I actually think for some people it's changed their lives for the better. But like you mentioned, it does attract people who have had eating disorders or who are at risk of eating disorders. And like, then they're in this place where body preoccupation, like monitoring every day, weighing every day, progress photos is normal. Whereas if they weren't doing bodybuilding, it would be deemed as an unhealthy behavior. So that's one of the criteria for an eating disorder, is like intense hyper focus on your body weight and shape. But then in the bodybuilding world, you have to do that, because you're trying to make all these changes and all this progress, and then you're stepping on stage for just that. So it's just to keep the awareness there, and to identify, like, is this still aligning with you? Is it still serving you? Is it actually something that you want to sacrifice?
Yeah. And because of the similarities in terms of how, at the end of the day, right, a contest prep, it if you looked at it, it is very disordered in the way that someone has to behave and eat. But it's supposed to be temporary in terms of when someone then transitions away or transitions into the improvement season. If all is well and good, technically they shouldn't continue those behaviors. But I think it's very problematic for anyone who's struggling with their relationship with food to a large extent to follow and engage in too much bodybuilding content, because of how similar the two would look. So that is something that, like, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I would say if someone is struggling with their relationship with food, bodybuilding content is probably not going to be beneficial to engage in because of the similarities.
Yeah, I think you're so right. Yeah. And again, like, it's attractive for people who are trying to be more disciplined and to be more motivated and stuff, because let's face it, like, if you're prepping, you are the most disciplined you've ever been, you're the most motivated you've probably ever been in that time, most of the time anyway. So then, like, really often we'll have general population clients who are struggling, who'll compare their behaviors to prepping behaviors, and they'll feel bad about the way they're acting because so and so, like, hasn't had a social meal in so long, and they're almost willing to do that to look the same as that person, which brings a whole host of, like, complications and stuff with mental health, physical health, overall relationship with your food and body. So it's, going back to that point about social media, like filtering your feed, and if you notice a physical reaction in you, just mute, at least for that time being.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think there are certain tools like tracking your food that can be really problematic for some individuals, but actually for other people, they could actually be helpful. Why is that they can be helpful in some scenarios, but really unhelpful in others? Is it down to someone's, like, personality type or their history?
Yeah, exactly that. I would say their history of dieting, their personality type. So if you're someone who gets completely obsessed with numbers, data, very much thinks in the black and white way, then tracking, you can thrive there and you can, absolutely love it. But there's a difference between, like, thriving and loving it and then not being able to not have it. And I think to be honest, the way we identify it is, if you can't do without it, then there's an issue.
Yeah.
If you can't function and you can't feel at peace without it, then there's something not quite right and you need to look at it. So yeah, exactly what you said. History of dieting. Like, we wouldn't encourage people who've had an eating disorder in the past to track. And if they did, it would be, making sure that you do have time away from it, that you have flexibility and variety in there. And yeah, that black and white way of thinking, like, if you're someone who goes over a couple of grams and you find it that really tough to deal with, then tracking isn't right for you, especially long term. So yeah, like, definitely isn't banned across the board. Like, I have clients who track, especially those who, like, need more awareness around what they're eating, or they might not know what's in certain foods, or they need to, like, increase their protein and stuff. So you'll probably do the same. It's just to notice when there's red flags, and the biggest one is when you can't do it out.
It's like, for the people who it might actually be helpful for, I think it can be helpful in the scenario that someone, say they have quite rigid food rules in terms of what foods they can and can't eat, but that's due to misinformation. It's not due to, like, disordered eating traits. It's actually just because they've read false information on social media. They've been told that they need to cut out carbs, for example, to lose body fat. If you give that person tracking as a tool and they realize, oh my God, like, I can actually eat bread and still progress towards my fat loss goals, that might actually be helpful for that person. But it's the people, obviously, that are the other end of the spectrum that are very meticulous with everything that it could be problematic for.
Yeah, you're right. And it actually, in some cases, can help improve someone's relationship with food. Like, I can even remember myself at the start being like, oh, I can have, like, something that's 80 calories, like, that's quote unquote healthy, but I can't have the same calories in a chocolate bar because that's bad. And, like, tracking can help with understanding that some more. But it's when the all or nothing mindset comes in, and it's like, you no longer know if you're full or you're not, or you're full or you're hungry. You no longer listen to what your body's telling you. You have no real concept of internal cues. And then removing the tracking is a bit of a journey then as well, isn't it? It's like a process that requires patience.
Yeah, 100%. Because I remember when I actually first started tracking, God, it must have been like 2014 or something. But I remember being like, oh my God, like, I can actually eat chocolate and still progress towards my goals. Like, it's great. And it actually helps me in those circumstances. And I fully believe that a large part of why I've never really struggled with my relationship with food is because of the introduction I had to bodybuilding, in that it was very evidence-based. It was very much like, you know, tracking but flexibly. I was allowed, there was no foods off limits and things like that. And I think that was really helpful for me, but I can see how it could be really problematic for other people.
Yeah. Especially with binge eating, because sticking to a certain calorie range is just, it really adds fuel to the fire, in that restriction feeling is so, it's so there, because you're like, well, I can't go over this number, and if I do, I've absolutely ruined it. And then that whole guilt and shame comes, and you know, I've blown it again, I'm never going to achieve this anyway, which leads to loads of other emotions that can cause a binge then as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I know we've spoken briefly about the importance of, if you're working to improve your relationship with food, the importance of focusing on that rather than body composition related goals. Is there ever a scenario where it might be helpful or it would be doable to pursue fat loss whilst improving your relationship with food?
Whilst improving your relationship with food, I would say yes. Like you can do both. I would say when it comes to binge eating disorder, fat loss can't be the priority at that time.
Yeah.
I think, again, person dependent. So tread carefully. If you are dieting while also trying to improve your relationship with food, like making sure you do have flexibility in there, you have food variety. You know, if you're tracking, you have time away from tracking, things like that. But definitely when it comes to binge eating, you can't have it as a priority. It's kind of a case of like, you can't run before you walk. And even if you were to focus on fat loss without solving the binge eating side of it, like you're never really going to maintain the results that you get anyway. So we say, like, do take the aesthetic goals aside temporarily, and you're indirectly working on body composition goals that you have anyway, because you'll be able to maintain them when it does come around.
Yeah, I think that's really important for people to recognize as well, in that if they're struggling with their relationship with food, but they're just continuing to pursue fat loss, they're actually hindering their progress over the long term, and they're not going to achieve long-term success with their body composition related goals until they address their relationship with food first.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like, also your motive probably to change your body at that point is, I dislike my body, I hate it, I want to hate this into change. So while you are improving your relationship with food, we also want you to improve your relationship with your body, because they come hand in hand. So by the time you get to that place, you're like, okay, I actually want to do this because I respect my body, I appreciate it, and I want it to feel as good as it can feel. So doing the fat loss from a more compassionate place, rather than I can't, you know, I hate how I look type thing. Yeah.
And so if someone is listening to this and they're currently struggling with binge eating, what would your advice be to them in terms of the first steps that they should take to help them improve their relationship with food?
I would say, okay, I'm going to presume that if you're binge eating, that you've been dieting for a long time. So number one, ditch the dieting and start regular eating. So bringing in a regular eating routine where you eat every 3 to 4 hours, and you have some structure there. So no matter what happens, if you have a binge, you go back to that. So we're not falling into the binge restrict cycle again. So I'm giving Rosalind's 2 cents on it here, but even if I had a client who I was coaching who was struggling with regular overeating or binge eating, who didn't have a disorder, this is what I'd be doing with them as well. And then I would remind yourself that just because it's a food-centered problem doesn't mean that the solution is always in the food. So really, really often we're seeking something out by overeating or binge eating. Maybe it's to fill a void, numb, distract from something. So getting really honest with yourself. Okay, what's going on here? How do I feel before I binge? What do I want more of in my life? So even going back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you would be aware of that. But if anyone isn't, just Google it. It shows kind of like all our needs as a human. We don't have just one. We have, I think there's 5 in the pyramid. And they range from like emotional, social, psychological, from our basic to our more like needs of fulfillment in our jobs and stuff. So there can be loads of different factors. So just get curious about that. The other thing I would say is slow down and bring in mindfulness into your life. So like, I love the model, Gilbert's model of emotional systems, where it's like your drive, threat, and soothe. And nowadays, like, we tend to spend so much time in the drive and threat and not enough in the soothe. So especially like, you know, the hustle culture, grind harder type stuff, and the drive is where most of us will sit, like that productivity, you know, must get my stuff done or else I'm not good enough type stuff, achieve. And the soothing is neglected. So when we reach our threshold, we inevitably reach our threshold, we'll reach for the nearest soothing, which is often food, and it does soothe in that moment. So we want to make sure that we're going between them all, that we do have our productive days and our busy days, but we also have our soothing. So more intentional soothing is, do you know what? I would say nearly the biggest thing we see is like people have no idea how to soothe themselves and no idea how to regulate themselves. So getting curious and creative with what you can do to soothe yourself on a daily basis, not just when you feel like you're ready to blow.
That was fantastic advice, and it's been such a pleasure to have you today, Bekka. Thank you so much. Have you got anything that you would like to add at all?
No, just thank you for having me. And if anyone's listening to this and they feel really lost and they don't know where to go, please don't be afraid to message me. If you know the support you're looking for isn't what we offer, then I'll guide you in the right way. But just don't do this alone, because there's so much shame and guilt. Now, thankfully, we're moving away from the shame and guilt and it's more talked about. But we must remember that like binge eating disorder was only recognized as a independent disorder, we'll say. So like there was anorexia, bulimia, etc. But binge eating didn't come into the equation until 2013. So that's really like not that long ago. So we're still building the awareness around it and people are talking about it more. But if you're still stuck there and you're like, nobody knows, I'm so embarrassed, please, you don't have to do this alone.
Yeah, I love that. And for anyone listening, I'll put Bekka's details in the description down below. So if you want to reach out to her, just head there. Thank you so much for listening. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you in the next.
See you soon.